Agriculture in Scotland includes all land use for arable, horticultural, pastoral or hunting activity in Scotland, or around its coasts. The first permanent settlements and farming date from the Neolithic period, from around 6,000 years ago. For the beginning of the Bronze Age, about 2000 BCE, arable land spread at the expense of forest. For the Iron Age, beginning in the 7th century BCE, there was use of cultivation ridges and terraces. During the period of Roman occupation there was a reduction in agriculture, and the early Middle Ages were a period of climate deterioration, resulting in more unproductive land. Most farms had to produce a self-sufficient diet, supplemented by hunter-gathering. More oats and barley were grown than corn, and cattle were the most important domesticated animal. From c. 1150 to 1300, the medieval warm period allowed cultivation at greater heights and made land more productive. The system of infield and outfield agriculture may have been introduced with feudalism from the 12th century. The rural economy boomed in the 13th century, but by the 1360s there was a severe falling off in incomes to be followed by a slow recovery in the 15th century. The early modern era saw the impact of the Little Ice Age, which peaked towards the end of the 17th century. The closing decade of the 17th century saw a slump, followed by 4 years of failed harvests in what is known as the Sevenile years. But these shortages would be the last of the kind. After the Union of 1707 there was a conscious attempt to improve agriculture among the gentry and nobility. Introductions included haymaking, the English plough, new crops, crop rotation, and enclosures were introduced. The resulting lowland clearances saw hundreds of thousands of cotters and tenant farmers from central and southern Scotland forcibly removed. The later Highland clearances saw the forced displacement. Much of the population of the Highlanders' lands were enclosed for sheep farming. Those that remained, many were now crofters, living on very small rented farms. In the 20th century, Scottish agriculture became susceptible to world markets. There were dramatic price rises in the First World War, but a slump in the 1920s and 1930s, followed by more rises in World War II. In 1947, annual price reviews were introduced in an attempt to stabilize the market. There was a drive in UK agriculture to greater production until the late 1970s, resulting in intensive farming. There was increasing mechanization and farming became less labor-intensive. UK membership of the European Economic Community from 1972 began a change in orientation for Scottish farming. Some sectors became viable only with subsidies. A series of reforms to the CAP from the 1990s attempted to control overproduction, limit incentives for intensive farming and mitigate environmental damage. A dual farm structure has emerged, with agriculture divided between large commercial farms and small pluralized and diversified holdings. Roughly 79% of Scotland's total land area is under agricultural production. Cereals accounted for 78% of the land area, while livestock numbers have been falling in recent years. Around 15% of the total land area of Scotland is forested, most in public ownership controlled by the Forestry Commission. Total income from farming has been rising since the turn of the millennium. Aquaculture production is focused on the west and north of the country. Some farm businesses rely on sources of income other than from farming. Scottish agriculture employs around 1.5% of the workforce and contributes to around 1% of the Scottish economy. Topography and climate. The defining factor in the geography of Scotland is the distinction between the highlands and islands in the north and west and the lowlands in the south and east. The Highlands are further divided into the Northwest Highlands and the Grampian Mountains by the fault line of the Great Glen. The Lowlands are divided into the fertile belt of the Central Lowlands and the higher terrain of the Southern Uplands, which included the Cheviot Hills, over which the border with England runs. The Central Lowland belt averages about 50 miles in width and contains most of the good quality agricultural land. Scotland is half the size of England and Wales in area, but with its many inlets, islands and inland locks, it has roughly the same amount of coastline at 4,000 miles. Only a fifth of Scotland is less than 60 meters above sea level. Scotland's soils are diverse for a relatively small country due to the variation in geology, topography, climate, altitude and land use history. There are very productive arable soils in the east of the country, including some of the most productive for wheat and barley of anywhere in the world. Scotland's soils differ from much of the rest of the UK and Europe, and they provide valuable habitats for wildlife and flora. They are largely naturally acidic in nature with high concentrations of organic carbon. They are predominantly coarse-textured and often exhibit poor drainage. The climate of Scotland is temperate and very changeable, but rarely extreme. Scotland is warmed by the North Atlantic Drift and, given the northerly location of the country, experiences much milder conditions than areas on similar latitudes. Average temperatures are lower than in the rest of Great Britain. Western coastal areas of Scotland are warmer than the eastern inland areas, due to the influence of the Atlantic currents, and the colder surface temperatures of the North Sea. Rainfall totals vary widely across Scotland. The Western Highlands of Scotland are one of the wettest places in the UK, with annual rainfall up to 4,577 millimeters. In comparison, much of eastern Scotland receives less than 870 millimeters annually, lying in the rain shadow of the western uplands. Annual average sunshine totals vary from as little as 711,114 hours in the Highlands and the Northwest up to 1471 to 1540 hours on the extreme eastern and southwestern coasts. Wind prevails from the southwest, bringing warm, wet and unstable air from the Atlantic. The windiest areas of Scotland are in the north and west, with parts of the Outer Hebrides, Orkney and Shetland experiencing over 30 days with gales per year. Vigorous Atlantic depressions, also known as European windstorms, are a common feature of the autumn and winter in Scotland. History. Prehistory Mesolithic hunter-gatherer encampments formed the first known settlements in Scotland around 8500 BCE. These were highly mobile, boat-using people making tools from bone, stone and antlers. In the Neolithic period, around 6,000 years ago, there is evidence of permanent settlements and farming. Archaeological evidence indicates that the two main sources of food were grain and cow's milk. For the beginning of the Bronze Age, about 2000 BCE, arable land spread at the expense of forest. For the Iron Age, beginning in the 7th century BCE, there is evidence of hill forts in southern Scotland that are associated with cultivation ridges and terraces. Souterrains, small underground constructions, may have been for storing perishable agricultural products. Aerial photography reveals extensive prehistoric field systems that underlie existing boundaries in some lowland areas, suggesting that the fertile plains were already densely exploited for agriculture. During the period of Roman occupation, there was regrowth of birch, oak and hazel for 5 centuries, suggesting a decline of population and agriculture. Middle Ages. The early Middle Ages were a period of climate deterioration, resulting in more land becoming unproductive. Most farms had to produce a self-sufficient diet of meat, dairy products and cereals, supplemented by hunter-gathering. Farming was based around a single single homestead or a small cluster of 3 or 4 homes, each probably containing a nuclear family. The climate meant that more oats and barley were grown than corn, and cattle were the most important domesticated animal. In the period c. 1150 to 1300, warm, dry summers and less severe winters allowed cultivation at much greater heights above sea level and made land more productive. Arable farming grew significantly, but was still more common in low-lying areas than in high-lying areas such as the highlands, Ganaway and the southern uplands. The system of infield and outfield agriculture, a variation of open field farming widely used across Europe, may have been introduced with feudalism from the 12th century and would continue until the 18th century. Crops were bare oats and sometimes wheat, rye and legumes. The more extensive outfield was used for oats. By the late medieval period, most farming was based on the lowland Firmduna highland bale, settlements of a handful of families that jointly farmed an area notionally suitable for 2 or 3 plough teams, allocated in run rigs to tenant farmers, known as husbandmen. Run rigs usually ran downhill so that they included both wet and dry land. Most ploughing was done with a heavy wooden plough with an iron coulter, pulled by oxen, which were more effective and cheaper to feed than horses. Key crops included kale, hemp and flax. Sheep and goats were probably the main sources of milk, while cattle were raised for meat. The rural economy appears to have boomed in the 13th century, and in the immediate aftermath of the Black Death was still buoyant. But by the 1360s there was a severe falling off in incomes, to be followed by a slow recovery in the 15th century. Early modern era. As feudal distinctions declined in the early modern era, the barons and tenants-in-chief merged to form a new identifiable group, the lairds, with the substantial landholders of the yeomen. These heritors were the major landholding orders. Those with property rights included husbandmen, lesser landholders and free tenants. Many young people, both male and female, left home to become domestic and agricultural servants. The early modern era also saw the impact of the Little Ice Age, of colder and wetter weather, which peaked towards the end of the 17th century. Almost half the years in the second half of the 16th century saw local and national scarcity, necessitating the shipping of large quantities of grain from the Baltic. In the early 17th century, famine was relatively common, with 4 periods of famine prices between 1620 and 1625. The English invasions of the 1640s had a profound impact on the Scottish economy. Under the Commonwealth, the country was relatively highly taxed but gained access to English markets. After the Restoration, the formal frontier with England was re-established, along with its customs duties. Economic conditions were generally favourable from 1660 to 1688, as landowners promoted better tillage and cattle raising. The closing decade of the 17th century, there was a slump in trade with the Baltic and France, and changes in the Scottish cattle trade, followed by 4 years of failed harvests, known as the Servanil years. The shortages of the 1690s would be the last of the kind. Agricultural revolution, increasing contacts with England after the Union of 1707 led to a conscious attempt to improve agriculture among the gentry and nobility. Haymaking was introduced along with the English plough, and foreign grasses, the sowing of ryegrass and clover. Turnips and cabbages were introduced, lands enclosed and marshes drained. Lime was put down to combat soil acidity. Roads built and woods planted. Drilling and sowing and crop rotation were introduced. The introduction of the potato to Scotland in 1739 greatly improved the diet of the peasantry. Enclosures began to displace the run-rig system and free pasture. The result of these changes were the lowland clearances, by which hundreds of thousands of cotters and tenant farmers from central and southern Scotland were forcibly moved from the farms and small holdings the families had occupied for hundreds of years. The Highland clearances, or the forced displacement. Much of the population of the Highlanders' lands were enclosed, principally so that they could be used for sheep farming. The clearances followed patterns of agricultural change throughout the UK, but were particularly notorious as a result of the late timing, the lack of legal protection for year-by-year tenants under Scots law, the abruptness of the change from the traditional clan system, and the brutality of many evictions. Of those that remained, many were now crofters, living on very small rented farms with indefinite tenure used to raise various crops and animals. For these families, kelping, fishing, spinning of linen and military service became important sources of additional revenue. In the 1840 and 1850s, Scotland suffered its last major subsistence crisis, when the potato blight that caused the Irish potato famine reached the Highlands in 1846. 20th century. In the 20th century, Scottish agriculture became susceptible to the ups and downs of world markets. There were dramatic price rises in the First World War, but a slump in the 1920s and 1930s, followed by more rises in World War II. In 1947, annual price reviews were introduced in an attempt to stabilize the market. After World War II, there was a drive in UK agriculture to greater production until the late 1970s, resulting in intensive farming. More areas of marginal land were brought into production. There was increasing mechanization of Scottish agriculture, and farming became less labor-intensive. The UK membership of the European Economic Community in 1972 began a change in orientation for Scottish farming. Some sectors, particularly hill sheep farming, became viable only with subsidies. A series of reforms to the CAP from the 1990s attempted to control overproduction, limit incentives for intensive farming, and mitigate environmental damage. A dual farm structure emerged, with agriculture divided between large commercial farms and small pluralized and diversified holdings. Modern agriculture. Land use. At the time of the June 2013 agricultural census, the total area of agricultural holdings in Scotland was 5.6 million hectares, equal to 73% of Scotland's total land area. Just over half of this was rough grazing, with about a quarter taken up by grass, and about 10% used for crops or left fallow. The remainder was made up of woodland, ponds, yards, or other uses. There was a further 580,000 hectares of common grazing, which if included made the total area 6.2 million hectares, or 79% of Scotland's total land area. Because of the persistence of feudalism and the land enclosures of the 19th century, the ownership of most land is concentrated in relatively few hands. As a result, in 2003 the Scottish Parliament passed a Land Reform Act that empowered tenant farmers and communities to purchase land even if the landlord did not want to sell. In June 2013, of crops grown in Scotland, cereals accounted for 78% of the land area, with nearly three-quarters of that being barley. Wheat was also significant, along with oilseed rape, oats and potatoes. Amongst fruit and vegetables, a total of 911 hectares of strawberries were grown, mainly undercover, which was the largest source of income amongst horticulture crops. The major areas of cereal production were Grampian, Tayside, Borders, Lothian and Fife. Livestock numbers have been falling in recent years. The trend began at the turn of the millennium in the case of pigs and sheep and dates to the mid-1970s in the case of cattle. In June 2013 there were 6.6 million sheep, 1.8 million cattle and 308,000 pigs, the lowest numbers since the 1940s and 1950s. Poultry numbers have tended to fluctuate over the last 25 years, but were down to 14.2 million in 2013. About 13,340 square kilometres of land in Scotland is forested, representing around 15% of the total land area of Scotland. The majority of forests are in public ownership, with forestry policy being controlled by the Forestry Commission. The biggest plantations and timber resources are to be found in Dumfries and Galloway, Tayside, Argyll and the area governed by Highland Council. The economic activities generated by forestry in Scotland include planting and harvesting as well as sawmilling, the production of pulp and paper and the manufacture of higher value goods. Forests, especially those surrounding populated areas in central Scotland, also provide a recreation resource. Income and employment. Total income from farming has been rising since the turn of the millennium. It was estimated at £700 million in 2012, being made up of £2.9 billion in outputs and £570 million in support payments, offset by £2.8 billion in costs. The initial estimate of TIF for 2013 was £830 million, an increase largely linked to the improved weather. TIF per annual work unit increased to £31,000, similar to the value in 2011. Aquaculture production is focused on the west and north of the country. The total output of aquaculture was estimated in 2011 at around £434 million per year, including around £412 million for farmed Atlantic salmon, £14.34 million for rainbow trout and £7.7 million for shellfish. Brown trout, sea trout, halibut and Arctic char are also farmed in Scotland. Some farm businesses rely on sources of income other than from farming, including contracting work, hosting mobile phone masts, tourism and recreation, and financial support from grants and subsidies. Analysis of the Farm Accounts Survey suggests that, excluding support from grants and subsidies, the average farm made a loss of £16,000 in 2012. However, calculations from TIF suggest that, excluding support, the sector still made a small profit. Government figures indicate that in 2013 Scottish agriculture employed around 1.5% of the workforce and contributes around 1% of the Scottish economy. Other studies suggest the employment rate to be around 8% of the total rural population, and in terms of numbers the estimates indicate that around 68,000 people are directly employed or self-employed in agriculture, while around 200,000 people are related to a variety of activities related to agriculture. In the Highlands and Islands, around 10% of the workforce are engaged in agriculture, and livestock products contribute around 70% of the output. Education. The West of Scotland Agricultural College formed in 1899, the East of Scotland Agricultural College in 1901, and the North of Scotland Agricultural College in 1904. These colleges amalgamated to form the Scottish Agricultural College in 1990. Environmental protection. Site-specific nature conservations began in the UK with the creation of the Nature Conservancy in 1948, which later became the Nature Conservancy Council. It moved from a research-based advisory group to become a campaigning body. The 1949 National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act excluded Scotland, but introduced the concept of sites of special scientific interest, which were to become a key part of managing nature conservation. A Countryside Commission Scotland was established under the Countryside Scotland Act, 1967. The SSSI were strengthened by the 1981 Wildlife and Countryside Act, which for the first time introduced the concept of payments to farmers for inactivity in relation to specific sites and shifted the burden of proof from conservationists having to prove harm to landholders having to prove that harm was not taking place. The NCC was broken up in 1991 and in Scotland was merged with CSS to produce Scottish National Heritage, under a UK-wide joint nature conservation committee. SNH has a remit for both land and nature conservation and a responsibility towards sustainability and to the consideration of the needs of the Scottish people. Rights of way. In Scotland, a right-of-way is a route over which the public has been able to pass unhindered for at least 20 years. The route must link to public places such as villages, churches or roads. Unlike in England and Wales, there is no obligation on Scottish local authorities to signpost or mark a right-of-way. However, the charity Scotways, formed in 1845 to protect rights-of-way records and signs the routes. The Land Reform Act 2003 gives everyone statutory access rights to most land and inland water in Scotland to non-motorised traffic, making the existence of rights-of-way less important in terms of access to land in Scotland. Certain categories of land are excluded from this presumption of open access, such as railway land, airfields and private gardens.